Welcome to the Moon Baby Magic podcast, a space to honor women's rites of passage stories. From menarche to menopause, the initiations of womanhood all live within our wombs. We are here to reclaim the sacredness of all of them. I'm your host, Natalie Elliott, birth keeper and women's coach specializing in womb wellness and hormonal healing. Ready for slow and sacred storytelling? Let's dive in. Hey, women. Thank you so much for being here on the Moon Baby Magic podcast. My intention in everything I do at Moon Baby Magic is to support women in coming home to the sacredness and power that lives within their very bodies. So if you'd like to go deeper, a few resources for you. You can follow me on Instagram. I love to connect with women there. You can get the Womb Cycle Spotify playlists, your period prep guide, book an in-depth one-on-one virtual session, or shop herbal goodies. All of these are always included in the show notes of every episode, and I hope that they support you. Thank you. Let's get on to the show. Hey, women. Welcome back to another episode of Moon Baby Magic. Thanks so much for being here, as always. So, depending on when you're listening to this episode, some of you might know that I just celebrated my 28th birthday on the 19th, and has the last year and a half of my life really initiated me into womanhood, adulthood, responsibility, my truth in such a gigantic and honestly rather intense way. This episode with Emily that you're about to get to in a minute is really rich, like chock full of wisdom on really aligning with your truth throughout each phase of your life and being in right relationship with who you are. So at the end of the episode, Emily talks a little bit about being in the void and allowing yourself to be there. And it's just reminded me so much of what I've been experiencing lately. And I wrote about this in my newsletter, which you can get on by tapping the link in the show notes for the Womb Cycles playlist and subscribing. But I just wanted to share this one here. The last year and a half of my life has honestly knocked me on my ass. It's not lost on me that I'm in my Saturn return, the astrological term for the time between ages 27 and 30 loosely, that characterizes stepping into adulthood, growth, responsibility, and you get the idea. As a growth-oriented person, I've been doing my best to go within and meet this challenge head on, but boy, has there been resistance, and I know there will continue to be. But a little something shifted in the last week for me. I bled, and then the full moon came, and then my solar return, all within a week. And as I was sitting by the river, watching it pass over the rocks and keep flowing, I zoomed out. Wow, how absolutely heartbreaking and beautiful this human life is. I want to fully experience it all, I heard a part of myself say. Well, some of you know that I have a very intentional devotional practice after I bleed of returning my blood to the earth and setting my intentions each new cycle, which you can get all the details about and more in your period prep guide, which is actually 28% off in honor of my birthday with code Happy Birthday. You can find the link for that in the show notes too. So I made my intention for this next month to zoom out and be fully present for all of life's pain and joy, and to ride through these rocks within my human experience, because I know the river will always keep on flowing. Now, let's be honest, sometimes this is way easier said than done. But over the last couple of weeks, anytime I've spun out, I've reminded myself to zoom out, and it is usually met with a deep breath and immense gratitude. There are a few other things that really help me in times of transition, and those are having a morning routine and supportive routines in general, eating nourishing and regular meals, reishi, lots of reishi, which you can get in my shop. And most importantly, really, is women. And this is what I really want to share today is I don't quite know how to capture in words the heart full of gratitude I have for the women in my life, but they have given me everything and more. Yeah. And I just want to pause there because this podcast is a podcast that's dedicated to stories of women. And it has been such a deep honor to hold these stories and to get to know wonderful and amazing women through it. And it's like the richest part of my life to be in relationship with the women that I'm in relationship within. And I hope you have that too. And if you don't, I hope that you create it for yourself because it is possible and you do deserve it. Um, I'm really excited to announce an upcoming upgrade to what has been my cyclical living circle, which will be transforming into a long-term virtual women's community space with regular live circles and teachings and a forum to connect with like-minded women and ask me questions that I can't necessarily answer on Instagram about health and wellness and cycle specific stuff. So more to come on that, but there will be one free circle on November 13th at 12 p.m. Eastern that you will get the info for if you're on my newsletter. Again, you can sign up with the Womb Cycles playlist link. And yeah, that will give you an idea if you want to join the long-term community. Well, thank you as always for listening to my musings. And yeah, you're in for a treat today. So on the podcast today, we have Emily Sims, and Emily is a menstruality mystic whose story is characterized by doing things a little differently and learning to be okay with that. You'll hear her stories of reclaiming her menstrual cycle, remembering God as both feminine and masculine, having a pain-free birth, and more. In each turn of the wheel, Emily has courageously chosen to question the narrative and step into her own truth while holding space for others to do the same. Tune into this one for a deep, nourishing, and playful conversation between two devoted women of the womb. Hey, Emily, welcome to the podcast. I'm so happy you're here.
Hey, thank you so much for having me. I'm just honored to be here.
This is gonna be fun. I'm laughing because we just had such a good conversation before we hit record. I wish that we had recorded some of that, but I know like so much magic is gonna come through as we continue speaking.
Yes.
So the first question I always ask is, I would love for you to share what phase of your cycle you're in and what phase of life you're in. And I know you have this common language with me as a fellow Blood Mysteries school grad. So yeah, would love to hear that.
Yes. So I am on day 25. So we are in luteal phase, inner autumn. That's the vibe. Yeah. So very much back to my inner world, very much kind of clearing things out, sorting things out. I really have come to appreciate and enjoy this phase.
Mm, I love that. Yeah, it's the phase I'm into. I was just sharing with you, like I'm on day 27. And it'll be like a longer than a 28-day cycle this month because I ovulated a bit later than usual, which just for anyone listening, like can happen for different reasons. For me, I think there was just I moved this month and there was like life changes. And so a little bit of stress delaying ovulation can happen. Um, but yeah, this phase like internally is inner autumn. And so like when the world is in autumn too, I feel like it's just such a autumn luteal time.
So good. So
But you're
good.
right. Like I find myself in this phase really like the other day I was like looking at my monthly like to-do list and I'm like, all right, like I just like in the morning was like, all right, let's get everything that's left on this to-do list done. Like it all needs to be finished now.
Yes. And you can do it.
Yeah. Yeah. What are your like do you have any specific sort of rituals, tasks, things that like come up in this phase for you and like specific to your life?
Ah, that's a good question. It's so interesting living cyclically because you can learn about it. And I think that it's important that we learn about it because a lot of us were not taught. But you also just start embodying it. You also just
Mhm.
realizing that it's a natural rhythm.
Yeah.
And so it's not even like I consciously try. I just notice one day that it's like, oh, I really want to delete all these random screenshots off my phone that I'm not going to do anything with, but I thought I was going to do it one time, or just things like that, or organize a room in the house. And I love the luteal phase because I thought of this like luteal phase hack, if you want to say it, to like
Mhm.
making a little extra cash is like you just put stuff on Facebook Marketplace. Because it's your time that you're like, I don't need this. And so you just let it go. So no, not necessarily consciously, but it is so interesting. Just the more that I live cyclically, the more that it's like, oh yeah, we're in inner autumn now because I desire to do these things and I have the kind of the energy and the capacity and the focus to do those things. So yeah.
Mhm. So true. And yeah, I love the luteal face hack with Facebook Marketplace because it's like you totally can let go of your attachment to things and let go. And so it's a great time. Yeah. And the energy is it's like your energy starts to go down at the end of the luteal phase, but of course, like, in the beginning, like there still is energy to finish stuff out and to move stuff. Like it's quite a dynamic phase in that way. The same way that like autumn is a dynamic season, like there's so many parallels in autumn. We have like we're harvesting, right? Like we're in the last harvest, and with the autumn equinox, maiden is like the last harvest, and there's like so much beauty and gift and gratitude in that. And then there's also these like leaves falling from the trees and this like decay. And I feel like our internal world really mirrors that.
Totally. It's this like beautiful, beautiful balance. And that is one of the most lovely things about being a woman is that you see it on the outside and everyone else gets to experience it on the outside. And then you also get to experience it on the inside.
Mhm. Yeah. And I think it does actually take like I don't know. I mean, it's funny because I just sent a newsletter about like taking a break from inner work. And I'm about to say this, but like I think it does take a certain level of inner work to be very comfortable in this phase because I know I can speak for myself. Like for a long time, my luteal phase, which I think if you're listening, you probably know, but it's the premenstrual time. So after you ovulate, before you bleed, like the inner critic lives there. And me personally, I have a very strong inner critic. And so, like, learning to work with that and not let it just like totally bring me to my knees.
Mhm.
Or like letting it bring me to my knees and like finding compassion for myself there, like whatever way you want to look at it,
Yeah.
has been quite the journey. And yeah, I think that it takes some time to get comfortable in this phase, but when you do, it can feel really raw and authentic. Like it's like your true self comes out in this phase. Do you feel like that?
Yes, it's so beautiful. And that's what it really is this coming to learn to love this part of yourself. Also, are you the oldest in your family?
Yeah, I am. Why?
Because I am too, and I find that the inner critic is pretty strong for
Mm.
the oldest in your
Oh.
family, and so and I think it can be it's strong for every woman, but I've just found that to ring true, and so
Mm.
it's I think one thing that was really helpful to me was learning to set aside your inner critic during other phases of your cycle because in this phase you can handle it and you can kind of work with her and listen to her for the little seeds of truth that she has. But if
Mhm.
like she comes up in your inner spring, it's like, hey, like I will hear you. And you have to actually do that. Like you have to actually hear her when you say you are going to, but like now is not the time. Like I'm pretty fragile right now, pretty naive, pretty fresh, like come back at a later time. And that has
Mhm.
been really helpful too, because it's allowed this like part of myself to be heard in the right phase that's like built for alchemy and built for more so for hearing things like that. So I love that as well.
I love that too. Yeah, the last thing I'll say about the luteal phase really is you were asking me before we hit record, like what my favorite cycle phase to record podcast episodes in is. And it's like kind of a hard question because like naturally I'd want to say ovulatory because that's like when we're
Ooh.
best on camera. And I do feel like it's really good then. Like there's like a lot of like like even now I'm saying and in my ovulatory phase, I would be so much more clear and sharp with my words.
Yes.
But and then inner spring is fun to record too, but it's like more of a lighthearted, like I was saying, girlfriend energy, which can be a fun energy depending on the content of the episode, of course. But in my luteal phase, like I actually really love recording specifically for this podcast in this phase because like we're holding stories here and it's a longer form podcast. And I just feel like the depth in the luteal phase allows me to like really be present for that. And so that's a fun part of it too.
Yes, I love that.
Well, yeah, we've talked about your cycle phase. So tell me the phase of life you're in. Let's talk about that.
Yes. So the phase of life I am in the mother phase of life. So I have a 4-year-old son. And so we're 4 years into a little bit more with pregnancy. And so it is just it's just a totally different phase of life, when you're responsible for another human, another um beautiful person that you've been given the honor to help guide and raise. And so I've learned so much in these 4 years, and it's just a beautiful phase of life.
That's so sweet. What was your like initiation? I mean, we'll get into your birth, but I guess what I want to ask is like what would you say the biggest difference in like how you go about your day-to-day life is from when you were a maiden to now being a mother?
I did not real I know this is such the common, but I did not realize how much time I just like had to myself,
Mm,
how much that would shift. And obviously, I still have time to myself, but that it's very different now because even your headspace is different. So even
yeah.
when you do have time to yourself, you're still a mom. And so you're still thinking about being a mom and your child and your whole family unit. And so that if I could look back, that was probably the biggest difference because I mean, I love me some time to myself and I love my community as well, but like time to myself, I just like just being by myself and reading and just having my own company. And so that was a huge shift for me.
Mm, yeah, I have talked to a lot of my friends who are moms about this because I think that that is like a really stark contrast between the experience of maidens and the experience of mothers. And of course, there's other like personality things that go into it too. For example, I'm extremely extroverted, which I've learned over time. And if I have too long by myself without like a social gathering or like people to hang out with, like I will go crazy. Uh, and it's almost like I have too much time to myself. And I'm trying to really like shift my mindset around that and enjoy it because I know that like I do want motherhood one day and I know it will shift.
Yeah,
And so it's just interesting like how different, the experience is.
mhm.
Yeah.
All there's like beauty and lessons and in all of the phases.
Yeah. Well, I really like to like travel along this red thread in the episode. And so I'd love to hear, your first blood mystery story, which is Menarche, the first bleed. Yeah, like what do you remember from that?
Yes. So when I first like consciously tried to remember this event, I had a little bit of trouble. So this was probably like 2 years ago at this point. And I was like, well, I think that it might be this one kind of place and thing, but I'm not actually quite sure. And I realized that I was with 3 of my friends and that they all remembered. And so I was like, oh, so this is interesting. This is not as maybe not as normal, you could say, to not remember this event in your life. Now, it might be common. Like you've probably talked to many women who are like, I don't really remember. But so it was like this mirror of like, okay, so these three women do remember and I don't, huh? Okay. So I like go on a journey with this and I am pulling up from the unconscious to the conscious. And so that's what I'm doing with this experience. And so for those who are like, I don't remember, it is within you. You do hold that memory, but you just might have to do some things, some work, however you want to phrase it, to like pull it up from unconscious to conscious. And so from this process, one of the things was the Menarche Reclamation with Nancy and Kristen, our teachers. And it was just beautiful. And so what I have realized from this whole process of like bringing this up is that it was where I thought it was at first, right? Like your initial kind of thing is probably correct. And so it was in the bathroom at a dance studio. So I was a dancer for, all of growing up into high school. And so I was at dance practice and it was in the bathroom there. And I was prepared in the sense that I like had what I needed, but I was not prepared in the sense that I knew what to do. So obviously using a pad is like pretty self-explanatory, but I did not know how to use a tampon. And that I didn't even learn until like months later. And it was actually my aunt who taught me. And so if I had a daughter now, I would not, I would advise against tampons, but this is where we were,
Yeah.
back then. And so I used pads for a long time because they were easy to use. Tampons, they just like scared me. Um, I didn't know really anything of my anatomy, and it scared me to put something in the vaginal canal, to even touch in that area. And so, okay, wait, I'll pause for questions, but if you have any, but if you don't, I'll keep going.
Yeah, it's interesting because like it's such a similar thread to my story. Where yeah, like I knew how to use pads and I really wanted help. I've shared this before, but like I really wanted help putting a tampon in and like I even asked for help. Like I even went so far as to ask for help and like no one would help me.
Mm.
And yeah, like I also had that like fear of anything being in my yoni. Like, yeah, anyways, continue.
Yes, and so yes, I'm also sorry that you asked for help and it wasn't given. Yeah, that's a huge thing. And so I wore pads for quite some time and um but I danced a lot. So during these years, I mean, I was dancing from about in dance practice from about 3 to 8 or 9 at night with some kind of break for dinner. But this is obviously a very active activity. And so pads are not the most conducive to that. But
Yeah.
again, it was this like shame of like, I don't know how to use this. I don't really know how to ask for help. And um, so it's just what I did. And it's so funny looking back because like we were in like tights and leotards. Like I'm sure that people knew that I was wearing a pad, but I like totally thought that I was like hiding that I was using a pad as if that was like something negative. But I
Yeah.
have this memory of we were in ballet class and I was standing next to a friend. We were doing some floor work and I said, we did talk a little bit about periods at that time. And so I said, oh, I just felt some blood come down. And she was like, oh, I don't ever feel that when I'm wearing a tampon. I only feel that when I'm wearing a pad. And I was like, she knows.
Oh no.
And like I can laugh about it now, but in that moment, it really was like, oh my goodness, I feel kind of paralyzed, kind of stuck. There's this situation that I feel like I can't get out of because I don't know how to ask for help. And so going back, especially during the menarche reclamation ceremony, what I would have loved to see, especially in the dance world that I was in, was just an honoring of young girls as they're growing up of, okay, maybe you're here, but you can sit at the front of the class or the back of the class and you can watch and observe, but you can. So honoring the natural downward motion at this time and allowing girls, even if they do have to be at dance practice, to rest. And so that was my kind of resolution from that process was it would be just so beautiful to honor young girls in that way.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's interesting. Like, I've interviewed so many women who have been in different, like, active sports or dance or, yeah, like whatever it is, and like have had similar reflections of like, oh, wow, wouldn't it have been nice to just be able to like take it easy on those days, especially in something like dance where it's like women, I mean,
Yes,
primarily at least.
yes, exactly.
There was something else I wanted to say about your story. I guess just in regards to the pads, like the embarrassment that young girls feel for using pads and like how ridiculous that is, and not ridiculous isn't like we shouldn't be embarrassed because of course we're going to have our emotions, our feelings about it, but just that like we are young girls, like it's okay to be using something gentle like pads. And of course, like what you and I know now, it's like that's definitely way better than the tampons. But yeah, I had someone actually the first episode of this podcast with my friend Kate Oakley, who has also taken the Blood Mystery School. She talked about that as well. And she talked about this term that like her friends had that was like pad baby. And, it's just like, why are we shaming each other? I wore pads until I was in college, like I didn't try to put a tampon in until I was in college. And I did. I had a lot of shame around it. And I think that maybe hopefully my words now can normalize this for some other girls, women, whoever, that like I still wear pads now. Like I think pads are way better than tampons. And of course, like certain activities, would be more difficult with pads, but it's like you're saying, if certain activities require tampons, then like maybe we just shouldn't be doing them when we're bleeding.
Exactly. It's like, oh, maybe maybe we can look at the physiology of women and say maybe rest is actually what's needed instead of trying to find this solution that will allow a woman to be consistent throughout her cycle.
Yeah. Well, I love that you were able to find like a resolution with that. Um, yeah, and I think that's like what the Menarche reclamation ceremony really can do for us and for women listening. Like the Menarche reclamation is really just this opportunity to go back to this first rite of passage and like feel what was there to be felt and then repattern and like give your younger self yeah, like what you really would have liked to receive in that time. And like we can give that to ourselves in our bleeds moving forward.
Mhm.
Yeah.
It is so beautiful.
Yeah. So thanks for sharing that. And yeah, so it sounds like you have your menarche. You go through some years of like using pads and feeling weird about it. You have this experience of someone realizing you're wearing a pad. Um, if you travel along your red thread through these womb stories, what kind of feels like the next point we hit?
So I was on birth control for several years
Mm.
in, I think, starting in middle school and into college. So a long time. What, I mean, if you think back to those formative years, it is a long time of suppressing hormones when they are trying to get figured out. And so, of course, there's some grief there. But I was on birth control, or at least I started on birth control because I was on the medication Accutane for acne.
Oh no.
So, first of all, that's just super intense in and of itself, and a whole a whole thing, but then you have to have two forms of birth control to even be on it because it will cause birth defects.
I was just talking to my friend who I'm living with right now about that yesterday. About she was talking about some medication that she had thought about going on, but it like you're required to like get your liver tested every so often because of it. And so I was like, that reminds me of how like you have to be on birth control to take Accutane, which is like probably we shouldn't be taking that then.
Maybe you shouldn't do that. So totally. And having the worldview that I do now, it's like, oh, well, that's a red flag.
Mhm.
Being within kind of the worldview that I was in at that time as a middle schooler who had acne, it was like, oh my goodness, this is amazing. And so that kind of started the birth control. And then I think I would just like stayed on it. And a lot of other friends were on it. It was not like a cool thing, but it was kind of this like interesting thing to
Mm.
to be on. And so, I mean, goodness, most of my formative years in that I was just suppressing these hormones. And so kind of what happens after that is I get more into like the natural realm. And
Okay.
this opens me up to, birth control, to being able to track your cycle. And then to the menstrual cup, which I
Oh,
don't
wow.
use anymore because I don't like I never liked how it felt. I know people say that it's comfortable.
No,
It just never was for me. Um,
same.
and so I assume if there was like something now in my life that I would need to use that for, maybe I would, like I still have it, but I'm mostly in period underwear and free bleeding, like on a blanket.
Mm.
That's what we do now. And
Mhm.
so, but at that time, this is what it opened me up to. And so I got off birth control, started tracking my cycle at that time. So this was probably 9 years ago at that
Okay.
point,
Yeah.
and just like fell in love with knowing who I was as a woman in this way and being able to know your body in such an intimate way that was kind of like, oh, you can't really know your body before, or you don't know, only the doctors know. And it's like, oh,
Right.
actually we can be sovereign over our bodies. And so that was really the opening at that time. So that feels like kind of the next point in the thread.
Wow. Yeah, I mean, I love hearing women's stories of like waking up. I mean, not that I love hearing that women are on birth control, but if they were, I love hearing their stories of like coming off of it and then realizing like how incredibly like wise our bodies are and how like how much we can be sovereign in our own lives. Like you're saying, it's really like you're like, oh wow, like my body tells me everything. Like I don't actually have to outsource this. It's yeah, I think it's like a I don't know why this is the term that's coming up. If people talk about like gateway drugs, like I always forget
Yes, yes,
younger.
yes.
I'm like tracking your cycle is such a gateway drug into sovereign living. You're like, wait, what?
Yes. And imagine this is like part of my vision that coming of age girls, now they're probably not going to track it in the way like that we would track it as adults,
Yeah.
but from the age where they have their menarche, that they're able to do whatever tracking feels appropriate, even if that's just tracking their mood or things like that. But to have that knowledge of self and of their own bodies from that young of an age, when they just like grow up into this wisdom, I'm so excited to see that.
Me too. Yeah, I was just talking to someone on my podcast the other day about that. Like, actually her episode will be released soon, Hu Yam. And she is like she has a coming of age girl and she's like working on this like protocol for her and her friends to like teach them like the basics of their cycle. And I just am like, that's so magical to like grow up and to have this information on like just that you change, throughout the month and that like you can't get pregnant any day of the cycle. And Yeah, like how much would that change how we are able to like step into our womanhood is a really exciting thought.
Yes. And I remember Nancy saying something about in teaching coming of age girls, like if they like made a bracelet together that they wear, when they're on their
Yeah.
bleed. And so it's like this like sweet thing of, oh, I know that this friend is on their bleed. And so you kind of honor and celebrate them in that, but also that they're in their own kind of in their own world, in their own form of ceremony for whatever that would look like for a younger girl,
Mm,
and just being able to hold reverence for where they are. I loved that so much.
I know. I love that too. To make it this like sisterly thing
Mhm.
that they get to experience together, and like that even makes me think that we could work on the sister wound in like little girls so they don't have to deal with so much sister wound. Like they're turning to their sisters for, yeah, like these common threads that we go through as women.
Yes.
Mm. So, okay, you start tracking your cycle, things change for you. And
Hmm.
who do you become with that?
Well, I become that's such a good question. I didn't have anyone in my life, and this was kind of a story up until like 3 years ago. I didn't have any woman in my life who kind of saw things the same way that I did. And so I felt kind of different. I felt like, oh, some women are kind of open to this, but some women think it's woo-woo. And, and we live in Alabama, and so it's very religious, and the city specifically that we live in is very medical.
Okay.
So it creates this very interesting
Yeah.
dynamic.
Yeah. Weird vibes.
Yes. And so become a woman who is doing this all like for herself, but not one who is in a place where like she's really seen, or that she like has these sisters that she is doing it with.
hmm hmm Which is like a big thing, because yeah, like I've even thought about this, like I kind of like go into my little, I call it my menstrual cave when I'm bleeding. And um lately I've been like, wouldn't this be nice to not like be alone? Um and sometimes I do enjoy that alone time. And like I said, I'm also naturally extroverted, so that can be
Mhm.
part of it too. But I do think that we're supposed to be experiencing our shifts, like tracking our cycles, like alongside women. Like the way I am filled up by talking to women about cycles together, like I do think that's part of the design. So I can imagine that time felt, yeah, like a little bit isolating.
Yeah. What you just said makes me think of the like red tent,
Yeah.
and how at this time it was like most of the women were bleeding at this time, and they would go and receive vision together. And I'm sure some of that was individual vision for their life, but a lot of it was, at least from what I've read and heard, a lot of it was like tribal vision.
Mm,
Had these like women coming together, receiving from God of like what to do next, or where to go, or where you will be one day. And I'm like,
mm,
that is so beautiful, because there is something really that feels really cozy to me about being alone in this time. But
hmm
I too have sometimes been like, okay, but with like my deep sisters, like it would feel really good to be with them too.
hmm Yeah, I know. I love thinking about the red tent that there's a book, The Red Tent by Anita Diamante. I'm not sure if you've read it, but
Yes, because it's about Dinah, right?
yeah, it's about Dinah.
Yes, yes. I read it a few years ago, and it is so interesting and beautiful. Um,
Mhm.
I would recommend that.
I know it was one of the first books I read, like sort of when I started learning about this stuff. My acupuncturist at the time, who was helping me with like painful periods, she gifted it to me for my birthday one year. And it was like such a special book for me at the time. And yeah, it tells, the story of sort of like the biblical women and what they were doing, which, the Bible doesn't tell that story. And so it shares like them going into the red tent and their rituals to the goddess Inanna and all of these like amazing, amazing things. And it's also like kind of a tragic story too, but
Mhm.
it's a beautiful one.
What a
Uh,
meaningful gift to receive, though.
I
Like, that
know.
was such a good gift.
Oh yeah, I was obsessed with that book. Like every night I was like making a cup of at the time I was drinking mugwort tea, which like is so funny because it's so bitter. But I was like really connecting with that herb at the time. It was like my first time connecting with mugwort. And so I was like making mugwort tea and like reading the red tent and like having my little salt lamp. And it was such a ritual.
What a special time. I
It,
think I went through that book pretty fast. Like, it
yeah.
was so
It's
intriguing
so good
to
because
me.
it's a story, right? Like it's a story. And so it's like reading fiction because it's not all like, we don't know if it's all like historical facts. There's like some, I think they say it's like, what's that term for like a book that's somewhat a true story, but not fully
Oh, realistic fiction, historical fiction.
historical fiction, maybe? Because there's like, it's based on elements of written record, but yeah, anyways, it's a great one. I highly recommend it. And okay, so I know from knowing you a little bit that you did have a background being Christian. So, like during this time, like what's the status of that when you're like learning about your cycle?
It's so interesting. I was thinking about that while we were talking about this book
Yeah.
because I like read that book, yeah, during this time where I definitely identified as like a reformed evangelical. And
Okay.
so these are pretty intense people.
Well, I don't
Um,
really know that much. I like had like maybe a
yeah,
2 year stint in college with Christianity, so I'm not super familiar. So tell me what that
yeah. So my my I can tell you my posture at the time because
is.
I
Okay.
can't speak to everyone who holds these views, you know?
Yeah.
Um, that would not be like honoring of me, but I can speak to my posture at the time was very, very black or white, very right or wrong, very yeah, I mean, I happen to be on the right side. I happen to be on the inside. And so the way that I saw the world was very like in someone was in or out. And the people that were out, well, we need to try to get them in. And
Mm,
I do think that there is a beauty in sharing God's love and experiencing God's love and with people and communicating about how we experience God because I think it's okay if we experience God differently. And I think that God can meet us in different ways. And I definitely still hold to that. Um, but the my my attitude and my heart posture towards honestly like others and even myself has really shifted throughout the years. But I remember just going on these different like rabbit holes and being like, I can't bring this up to people because I'll be told it's wrong um or like, yeah, we don't do that or that's not good. And so honestly, a lot of the things that I learned along the years I kept to myself out of fear of um being a I'm just laughing because it comes down to being seen as a heretic, which is something that I've actually learned to come to embrace
mm,
because what I thought a heretic was someone who was wrong, someone who was incorrect. But that's not what a heretic is. A heretic is someone who has different beliefs than like the majority. I'm like, oh,
mhm.
that's fine.
That's great.
I can do that. That's fine. And so I was actually trying to live against my design. Um, and because I know we've talked about human design a little bit, but part of that is being somewhat of a heretic. And so I was trying to live outside of my design by being fearful of not bringing these kind of different ideas. And so yeah, so that's
Wow.
what that is.
Yeah, I mean, so much there. It's interesting. Like I can relate in my own way. Like I said, I I explored many religions. I didn't grow up religious, so I kind of had a blank slate. And so, yeah, I explored Christianity a little bit when I was in college and met some like really amazing people from it. And like,
Uh,
I think it actually really, it wasn't the first religion I explored, but I think that Christianity specifically like opened my heart up in a very particular way, which it was so beautiful. But the kind of one of the reasons I left that world was um, I started getting into yoga and I was like really connecting with like yogic spirituality and the chakras and like feeling really like, yeah, like healed so much by my yoga practice. And that was like a big part of my spiritual journey. And I remember going to like the pastor at the church and being like, I know sometimes like yoga is considered not like right in the Christian world. And I was thinking like he was like a young pastor. I was thinking he was going to be like, oh no, of course, like you could
mhm,
practice yoga, but he didn't, like he was like, yeah, it's like it's not good.
mhm.
And I remember then I was like, how could something that's filling me up so beautifully be not good? And that's when yeah, like my spiritual journey really started to be my own and not like me trying to fit into something else. And it sounds like that, yeah, that's kind of what happened for you. And I think that's like such a rite of passage.
It is a huge rite of passage and not one that I was like necessarily asking for or like prepared for. But I think that it's really important for people to know, kind of have their own experience into what they believe and how they connect with God, and also still like how I connect with Jesus too
Mhm.
is still a part of my life. And so it's very, specific to your own experience. And also you can hold lightly that like you may be in a place now that in a couple years may evolve and change, because that's just how we are as humans. And so there's a lot, there's more, yeah, more of a lightness of just being held by God and trusting, and not always believing that, oh, I'm being led down a slippery slope, because that's like the kind of the terminology of that, that I experienced a lot. And so being like, yeah, trusting Holy Spirit to guide you, and trusting that these things are good and that these things are part of like how God has created the world. And even though it doesn't fit within maybe this box, over here, like, are you okay to kind of step out and to see the beauty in a lot of other beautiful things that God has created? So it's
Mhm.
such an individual journey, and there's a lot to say about that. But for any woman who's listening who might be in a similar kind of situation, like, I would just offer, it's okay, and you are always held by God, and that doesn't change.
Mm. Yeah, thanks for that. I think that's a really good thing to remember is like, yeah, like we are whole and complete exactly as we are, and so loved and divinely guided and supported. And I'm curious too, like what beliefs or what places you had landed that you felt like you were what is a heretic? Is that the word?
Yeah. So let me take a deep breath.
Yeah.
So a lot of my personal individual journey was seeing and experiencing, like, it would be hard to even go into in this kind of format, but experiencing that, um okay, because within the way that I kind of grew up was that the Holy Trinity was all, um male, or yeah, I'll just say male, although obviously God is spirit.
Mm.
So, but you would always say he. Obviously, Jesus was a man.
Yeah.
But for the Father, that's masculine, and then even Holy Spirit would be masculine. And I had heard things just like here and there about, well, like, there's feminine language for Holy Spirit, but it was like very much shut down of like, that is, not a correct translation, or that's like blasphemous.
Mm,
The more that I went into it, and the more that I actually had my own experiences and like spiritual experiences with that, I realized that doesn't make sense though. Like, that doesn't make sense that a view of God would be only masculine.
mhm.
It's God is everything. So there is this feminine nature of God. And even in the Bible, God is described as a mother hen, as a birthing mother. And
Mm,
so, but those things in my experience can get kind of discarded. And
yeah.
so that was a huge journey for me, which to some of you guys listening, you might think, well, that is kind of basic, or like, that's so interesting that that was such a huge kind of part of your journey. But from where I was, it really was um, a very integral kind of point in my journey. And so, yeah, again, for some people, they might be like, oh, that's not even that like profound. But for where I was, it really was.
Wow. Yeah. I mean, it's a huge thing to like grow up in sort of a doctrine that shows like the divine as something that you are not, right? Like as a woman, and then you're always thinking the divine is masculine. And then like what does that do to a young woman's psyche and sense of self and sense of power and agency, sovereignty in her life, like all these buzzwords I could throw out there. But um, yeah, so I can imagine that that was like quite the shift to be like, wait, if God is everywhere, then God is male and female, then I have God within me and I'm a part of this too. And like, is that kind of how it felt? Like it just like a big expansion?
Oh my goodness, yes. And I was also at this time in like a kind of a deeper dive to the menstrual cycle, and realizing that there's yin and yang, and it's not
Mm,
only one, and not only one is good, but even in the menstrual cycle we have both of these things. And so I'm like, okay, so it is both, and even I can reflect that as well. um oh wait, there was something that you said. Oh, I totally, the fact that you brought up the psyche is so interesting to me, because I've been having these conversations with my husband of, um, it might be harder for him to realize like how impactful this was for me, because he grew up with the language of he and masculine, and that's mirrors who he is. But I'm
yeah.
like, imagine growing up and even the slightest like, her, she, question mark, like the feminine in God, and it being told like, no, that's actually blasphemous, is like,
Yeah.
what does that do to the psyche, when like it doesn't, to me, where I'm at now is it doesn't make sense if you think about God in union, like creating. There does have to be this yin and yang aspect. There does have to be this masculine and feminine aspect. Like, we need each other and both are good. And
Yeah.
so I just really appreciate that you brought that up, because that I've been thinking about that a lot.
Mm. Yeah. Thanks for sharing that. And of course, it's like the feminine is like what births things into this world. It's like the literal bridges between heaven and earth. And so, of course, like there's holiness within us too. Um,
Yes.
yeah,
Yes.
yeah. I don't know how you resonate with this, but there's this song. I think it's by Danit, Danit, and she has a really beautiful voice. But in part of the song, it says Divine Father and Mother Earth.
Mm-hmm.
And when I like think about that, like, of course, there's like the Divine Mother too, and whatever. But when I think like Divine Father, Mother Earth, like that feels so true to like my soul of like, oh, there's this union. Um, yeah. So I love thinking about the union of feminine and masculine and yin and yang and Yeah, you and I have had so many conversations about how we phrase it because sometimes feminine and
Yes,
masculine gets a little funky, but yin and yang and
yes.
whatever sort of terminology you like to use, these two opposing forces that need each other. Because, like when you see the yin and yang sign, it's like we learned this in Blood Mystery School. There's always like an element of the one and the other, and they're
Mm,
constantly chasing each other, like always in flux. And yeah, thanks for sharing that. It's a really deep, beautiful story.
yeah, thank you for hearing me.
Yeah. So, speaking of women are the ones who give birth, I'm curious like where your fertility journey, pregnancy, birth, like where does this fall on this whole timeline?
Yes, so okay, so years ago at this point, we decided that we were ready to call in a child. That's not the language that we used at that point. But so I was actually vegan at this time,
Oh,
which is
wow.
so interesting because actually that was a huge part in like even me entering into the natural world, which is like getting off of birth control and all that. And so I feel like so many people have their journey with veganism.
Same.
So yeah, it's a part of it. And so I was vegan and was like realizing that okay, this is not the most nourishing thing, especially for wanting to bring a child into the world. And so started like nourishing myself and then like we got pregnant and um the let's see, the pregnancy was fairly asymptomatic. And like I even remember people asking me how I was feeling, and I was like totally fine. But I was like, should I be feeling something? Should I be feeling sick? Should I be hurting? Should I? But like it was so fine. Um, and after I kind of got out of the early stages of pregnancy, I was like, okay, I think this is just how my pregnancy is. But in the like, beginning stages, that was really um almost like nerve-wracking to me to be able to for someone to ask me and be like, I'm fine. And so, and that was, I kind of chalk that up to discomfort in having my own experience because I was looking to like what were other people's like common experience. And so, okay, then that should be mine. But I'm actually having this totally opposite experience and it's really uncomfortable for me. Um, so that kept yeah, so the pregnancy, kept going. And then I was reading this book. What was it called? Supernatural Childbirth. And it was just prayers and stories of um, pain-free childbirth.
Wow.
And so I read that like my whole pregnancy. I like listened to it and was like having faith, but also holding it loosely. Like, this is wild. I'm also not telling anyone about this other than my husband, who's like, okay, like do your thing, I guess. And so I'm like holding this, which could have been a really important part of the journey. And I'm like kind of imagining and praying for a 5-hour labor.
Mm.
And we were having a home birth. And so at this time, yeah, at this time in Alabama too, I think home birth had like just recently like become legal. And so um the midwife that we had, there was also another midwife in training that was under her. And so there was a lot of people at the birth because there was our midwife, the midwife that was in training, the birth assistant, our doula, a birth photographer, and then me and my husband. Like so many.
Wow.
We lived in this like tiny, tiny little house at that time. And so this doesn't fall within like the realm of like sovereign birth, you know. But it's our story.
Hmm.
And so I started feeling this like discomfort in my back early that day, like 1 o'clock or something like that, 12, 1, something like that. And so I like got in the shower to try to like kind of soothe it, calm it down. then had the bloody show, and I was like, oh,
Mhm.
okay, I guess this is happening. And so I call my doula, and she comes, and she's like kind of confused. She tells me this later. She's kind of confused because she's like, I was like tracking your contractions and how far apart they were and everything should have said that you were like really far along, but you weren't presenting like that. You were just
Right.
kind of in your zone. You were just kind of doing your thing. You were just breathing. And so,
Right,
but
because like as you know, I used to be a doula and I
Mhm.
don't like attend births in that way anymore. But when I was a doula, like one of the things that was like key to look for is like when your client calls you to like notice their state of being. And if they're far enough along, they'll hardly be able to talk to you. They're gonna be whatever, whatever. And so I can imagine you being like relatively fine is a bit of a shock to her and like, yeah, confusing.
Yeah, I think she was like quite confused. But then
Yeah.
my contractions were like, however, not, very, very close together. And so then she calls the midwives to come. And so they get there around 5 p.m. And I, they get there around 5 p.m. And I did not want cervical checks.
Yeah.
But for some reason in that moment, I wanted one. I think because it was like, I just don't, I knew that my contractions were really close together, but also I just felt very, now it was intense, right? But it wasn't like excruciating. It wasn't, I was just breathing. Like I hardly moved. I think I'd changed positions like a couple times, but I was just breathing and I was so in the zone. So I was kind of like curious of what was going on. So I had, right when they got there, I had a cervical check. I could like hear them whispering. I couldn't hear what they were saying, but I knew they were whispering. And
Mm-mm.
they're like, we're gonna have to check you again. I was like, okay, whatever. No, it was not, did not feel great, like at that stage. And so they're like, okay, well, you are 9.5 centimeters dilated. And I'm like, great, okay, cool.
Wonderful.
This is just great. And so I even I think this was just like a funny aside, but at one point my midwife like comes over to check on me and she's like, "How are you?" And I'm like, "I'm good. How are you?" And she's like, "What?" And so, but it was like from my perspective, very, very peaceful. I think that my husband probably had some nerves because I don't think that he probably actually thought that it was going to be this like quick labor that I had been praying
Yeah,
for.
of
And so I just keep doing my thing. Like it was just very,
course.
very focused and intense, yes, but not, I really would not use the word painful for my experience.
Wow.
And anyway, so then they're getting the tub ready, my water breaks, I get in, like all just very, very seamless. And so there was one part when I started pushing where I was like, that does not feel good. Um, and so I wonder more if I'd breathed instead of like kind of bared down and pushed, if that would have had a different effect. Um, and so yeah, so he came out super quick and it was just this like this is crazy. Like I didn't even wake up thinking that he was going to come that day because people were telling me I was 39 weeks at that point and people were telling me like, "Oh, it's going to be like 42 for you cuz you're like too comfortable." And so I was like, I mean, he's not coming for like 3 weeks. So I was totally shocked and it was just really, really beautiful. And there's some
Wow.
things about like the kind of afterbirth that I feel like I'm still processing because I was in a different state of mind then than I am now with like in a more kind of sovereign state of mind. And so there are still things um regarding like a shot of Pitocin that I like have questions about and that I'm like in the process, which is kind of interesting. Someone listening might be like, "Oh, it's been 4 years." But like you have to go at your own pace. And so that I've had like some conversations with some of the women that were present Um, and it's not easy. Like, and I'm sure that you know that too, but it's not easy to have these kind of conversations with women that you love and that were such a part of your story. And so I'm just holding that part with a lot of care and compassion.
Yeah.
Um, and so, but I remember even very shortly postpartum, I mean, I say very shortly, it's probably like a couple days later, even telling my midwives that I don't feel like I had this, like, I went to the depths of myself and, that kind of initiation. But I feel like it actually came through kind of my postpartum experience.
Mm.
So that was where I experienced that kind of like going to the depth of myself. But I also wanted to pause in case you had anything to say.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, so much because like what an incredible story of like, you were saying even it even draws a parallel to the story of like Christianity and being a heretic and all this stuff with like having a different experience than other people. Like you had a different experience in your pregnancy and birth that was like a really beautiful experience. And so it feels like that was maybe an initiation for you to like allow yourself to have a different beautiful experience. And of course, like pregnancy is this state of expansion, like quite literally. And so that is on other fields besides the physical. And so it's like expanding so much for you and this like beautiful birth story. I mean, and there's always going to be pieces to pick apart and process. And I think that that's a normal, a normal thing. And I also think it's amazing to be able to have difficult conversations and disagreements and clearing conversations with like women in your life because that's how we stay in right relationship and like don't create weirdness. But like not everyone can do that, so it can be hard.
Yeah. If you're willing to have the conversations, it can mend a lot of things. But when we're not willing to like have conversations with people who maybe you have a different opinion on or see things differently or disagree, then you actually just kind of put them in this, you create like distance and you create even still this kind of like in out, or they think this or I think this and I'm
Yeah.
over here and over there. Like you create this by not having these conversations. But when you're able to come together, there can be, I don't I think there's probably cases where maybe that's not either immediately on the table or whatever. But when you are able to have these conversations, it can mend and create this place of belonging rather than fitting in. I wish I knew who I saw this from on Instagram, but I can't remember. But she's talking about the difference in belonging and fitting in. Because
Mm,
belonging, or fitting in rather, okay, is when you go in a group and you're like, who do I have to be to fit
yeah.
in, to be a part of this group? But belonging is you're a part of the group. Like we can handle differences, we can handle these hard conversations. And I have just loved that ever since, because I grew up in a way that was very much fitting in and not belonging. So now to like live in a way that I do try to foster belongingness is a just a journey, and it's not always easy, but I think that it's really important in our society.
Yeah, it's so well said. I just absolutely love that because in a true community, like of course we're going to have so many different types of people and like we need that, it's actually doesn't serve us to all have like the same way of thinking and being and yeah. Um so I'm curious too, like one question about the birth story and then I want to hear about the postpartum. So like during this time, are you like aware, like, wow, I'm having my pain-free birth? Or like what is kind of like the inner dialogue, if there is
Okay.
any?
Wait, like, am I aware that
Like, are
wait,
you
so
like, oh, it's happening? Like, oh, this is happening. Or are you just kind of like in it? And
that is such a good question. I think I did have some level of like it's happening, but it was just
yeah, it sounds like you were in the zone.
totally in the zone, which is a just beautiful place to be. It actually reminds me a lot
Yeah.
of like the void
Mm.
And the that ties in with like menstruation, just that like I'm like here, but not. And but I remember them telling me afterwards, like, oh yeah, remember that playlist that you like spent hours creating? We asked you like several times if you wanted to put that on. And I'm telling you, I never heard a thing about it. Like it was just so, so in the zone, which I'm sure that's like common. But
Yeah.
but yeah, so I think probably to some extent, but also just surrendering to the sensation because it wasn't sensationless, um,
Yeah.
but allowing kind of what came up. Yeah.
Oh, ugh, I just love hearing that. And I think it's such an important story to share so that like other women can have like an imprint of that, because most of the imprints we receive, I mean, I'm actually grateful that I'm like in a place in my life where like I receive a lot of positive birth imprints from the people in my life, but this specifically one is really important around like, yeah, like you can manifest the birth of your dreams. And like this type of birth, it's not saying that like everyone's going to have that, but like it is an option. It is possible.
Yeah, and I think that a huge reason why that was my experience was because I had been receiving a lot of those imprints. Like I read that book every day and just received like this is possible, and also still holding to the mystery of like I don't know why that doesn't happen to everyone. I don't know if when I give birth again if that will happen,
Yeah.
and so holding to that mystery, because there's just so much we don't know.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So take me to your postpartum.
Okay, so oh great, oh we're great on time.
Yeah.
All right, so postpartum. So he was born in June of 2020. So this is kind of what the context in which he was born into was, during 2020.
Yeah.
And we we as a family were having a lot of uncertainty because we lived somewhere overseas for a little bit, and then we came back to Alabama, and then we were going to go back long term. But because of COVID, this is not what ended up happening. And so during
Oh.
this time, we were like, are we going to be able to go back? And it was actually the place that my husband was raised. And so,
Mm.
like, for obviously for him, this is very painful. And so there's a lot of uncertainty. We're learning how to be new parents. Neither of our side of the family had any babies. So
Oh,
our
wow.
son is still, and like he still is the only one right now,
Mm.
on both sides. And so we did not, I mean, we were like truly learning. We didn't experience a lot of support just because of the time. Now people like dropped off meals, and I was super thankful for that. But not many people came in, and so we also moved houses twice within our son's first 3 months of life.
Mm.
And it was just due to this, like, where are we going to be? We need this kind of temporary housing. No, okay, we need more like kind of permanent housing. And my parents sold their house, like my childhood house, during this time. So, like, just a lot.
Yeah.
And one of the things that I experienced for probably a full year postpartum was such a tendency towards clogged ducts and mastitis.
Mm.
And there's like a lot there if I think about that experience, because if you look from like a German new medicine lens, then mastitis is like an adaptation from a separation conflict. So it can either be from like the fear of separation, which I experienced, the fear of separating from our baby,
Mm.
and then also like separating from a home. And so we
Mm.
had that. I got hit on so many different levels because like
Wow.
we moved twice, and then my parents sold their home, like my childhood home. And so I can like see that play out. Now I had no idea about this knowledge at that point in my life. But it was really hard because I also did not want to go anywhere, because when my son was out and about, he was like a very distracted eater. And I was like, I like need you to get as much milk out so that I don't get a clogged duct and then potentially mastitis, because I got mastitis a few times. Um,
Yeah.
and I had such a fear of taking antibiotics at that time, which,
Mhm.
like, obviously I wouldn't want to do that now, but I think when you're first kind of waking up to a lot of that stuff, there is some fear. And or at least there was for me. And so I was like, almost like that would just be awful if that'd be like the worst thing if I had to take antibiotics. And so there was this fear of like, I can't let that happen. And so it was pretty isolating for me because I mean, I chose to not really be supported and to not have support and to not go out into the world because
Mhm.
I didn't want to experience these like clogged ducts and mastitis and all of that. And so that was a really challenging part of it for me.
Yeah, I mean, the amount of isolation, and a lot of postpartum mothers already experience a sense of isolation because, I mean, yeah, like we're not living in community where we're all like taking care of each other all the time. Although I have witnessed that in action recently with a community I was staying in, and so it is possible. But yeah, if you have to set that up for yourself, you have to create it for yourself. And like, of course, it's so sweet to have people coming and dropping off food, but like human interaction is also really important. And whew, yeah, just like a lot of love for that because that I have had women on the podcast who have also dealt with like challenges in the breastfeeding journey. And um I've heard that it's just like, it's not something you think about. Like when you're like getting pregnant and giving birth, like you just think, oh yeah, like you don't really think about breastfeeding and how that's going to be. So I can imagine it was like a bit of a shock in addition to like the isolation that was already happening in the world.
Yes. And I totally agree with you. Prepare for your birth in so many ways.
Hmm.
Yeah, than breastfeeding. I mean, I'm sure I knew like the basics, but I didn't understand for me, and for some people, they don't have that experience, you know? But for me, it was this just overwhelming experience. For me, my son was like totally fine. Like he's he's getting like all the milk that he wants and needs and all of that, but um for just varying reasons, for me it was this like constant oversupply. And you hear that and you think, oh well, I think uh it can be common to think that women with that get mastitis a few times have, keep their babies like on a strict schedule and with feeding. And I'm like, we just didn't do that. And so it's like there's this mystery too of like, I mean, I can kind of piece together some of the reasons that this was happening, but it's also like, I don't know. I did all the things that you're like supposed to. And so there was still this so that was my like going to the depths of myself and
Mhm.
and surrendering and meeting my experience head on, even if it's not the experience that I wanted to have, trusting that it was the experience that I needed to have. So again, I have this kind of birth, but then I have this kind of postpartum, and so we can kind of hold it all, and even in one person's experience there's these different points.
Yeah, and that like we all have such different experiences.
Such different
Yeah.
experiences.
So yeah, we have like a time gap. Your son is 4.
Yes.
So yeah, to finish up, I'd love to just hear like take me from postpartum to now. Like who have you become in these 4 years?
Okay. So Paris Hodges, I heard her say on one of her podcast episodes, she was talking about her son, and she said, he saved me in so many ways because of the woman he's called me to become to help mother him. And
Mm,
I felt so much resonance there of, for me, it's looked like leaning into who he is to see what he's asking from me.
mm,
Because our children are such great teachers. And
mm,
so in a lot of ways, I think back of like, oh man, like I wish I could have been this person that I am today. Like I wish I could have been that on the start of my journey. Like that would have just changed so much. But it's like, but no, the reason I am the person I am today was because of this journey, because of my son, because of the lessons that he's bringing to me, and because of like who he is and who he's asking me, what he's kind of like pulling out of me in a way. And so it's just this part of life where it's like, oh, I wish that I knew that then, or I wish I could have kind of had this mindset then. But the reason you have the mindset is because you went through that, you know?
yeah.
And so yeah, I am a woman who is more confident in her own life, her own design, and I can see other people like who they are. And it's a really beautiful way to live, to be able to see people for who they are and not like fitting them in a box or not wishing that they were a different way, or but like living in acceptance to what is happening in life is meant to be happening. And so it's a very different mindset.
Mm. I just love that. And I think it's such an important trait to have in today's world is to like be open to who people are and the truth of who they are and to be able to connect with people who are from so many different walks of life with so many different lived experiences. And it's like that came because you've had many different lived experiences that you like didn't expect from your
Yeah.
life. And I mean, isn't that life? Like we never know. But
Experiences you didn't expect, you didn't ask for.
oh, all the time. Oh. Oh. Well, I have one final question for you, unless there's something else on the story that you feel important and like is important to share.
I think that gives like a good representation.
Yeah. And I love that quote too. I've heard that from a lot of mothers that it's like, and I've heard it, I don't know if it was, maybe it was Jordan Peterson. I think it was Jordan Peterson who says like that we reach full maturity when we become parents. And
Mm,
like those are the most mature people in our worlds. And that we don't actually see that in our society. We see like highly educated people as the most mature, but like actually what it takes to be a parent is like what it takes to reach maturity. And I
I
mean, that's
love
like, of course, he's talking about kind of on like a mental emotional level, but it's like, of course it is because on a physiological level, like even as women, like our breasts don't reach full maturity until like we nurse a baby, right? And so, um, yeah, it's interesting to think about.
I remember learning that
Yeah.
gosh, years ago at this point, probably close to the time that I was like getting off of birth control. And I
Mm,
thought, that is fascinating because that shows that there's like purpose in the breast for them to come to this full maturity after nursing.
yeah.
Whereas, in society it can kind of have an opposite vibe to it.
Yeah. Well, Emily, the final question I always ask the women on the podcast is to share whatever piece of womb wisdom is alive for them right now that you'd like to leave with the women listening.
Mm, well, we have kind of touched on this,
Mhm.
but something that that my friends and I say is like befriend the void, and learning to be in this space that kind of feels like chaotic waters or chaotic nothingness, but to be okay being in that space, because a lot of us can feel good if things are like organized and we kind of see the purpose behind everything. But I think a huge lesson is, can we feel that same peace when it's not like that, when you're in this place where you're like, I don't really know what's happening next, or I don't know how to contextualize my beliefs right now, or I don't know whatever it is for you, but to be okay knowing that like that time may come, when things will become more, you know, more yang in nature, or more conscious, or more organized, but to be okay in the potential of that, the not yet of that, and just be. So I have learned that I want to say skill, but I feel like that's a kind of like a masculine, has a masculine way about it, but and also like I haven't learned it in the sense that like I'm just like so good at it now. But living in relationship with your cycle, and especially during your bleed, I feel like can awaken this like ability in you to be able to do that. And so that's what I have experienced, and it has been very fun, very very sometimes you just don't know what's next, and that's okay. That's a part of life. And if we're able to accept that moment for what it is, then the journey becomes a lot more peaceful. So I say that that's not always my experience, but that's something that I'm a lot more aware of.
Yeah, like something you're orienting to. And
Yeah.
I think that's so important. And wow, I needed to hear that. So thank you.
Thank you.
Well, I would love for you to share, where women can find you and what you're offering and whatever wants to come up in that realm.
So you can find me on Instagram at Rose Reclamation. And one of my offerings is called Meet Your Menstrual Cycle. And it's a 3-hour teaching where we go into charting your cycle, the inner seasons, and the cyclical nature of life. So that is a lot. And so we're not going like to the depths of each of those things, but it's a good amount of knowledge there. And so the way that I do this is when a group of women is ready, then they can come to me. And if you're like in the area near me, I really like to do them in person, but I can also do them virtually. But it's really designed for women who are already in relationship with one another, because it's like you receive this wisdom, you integrate it for yourself, but also within your already existing group dynamic, because I think that there's so much power in that for women specifically. And like how we touched on like the sister wound, and just and coming together in that way. So that is how that is designed, and I love doing that. And I also do some one-on-one work. So if you're interested in just seeing what the bigger picture of what your menstrual cycle is telling you, that is something we can do. And then I also have a group container and one-on-one mentorship that's really about finding and discovering, who you are on a few different levels. And so that is what I have right now.
Such amazing offerings. I love that Meet Your Menstrual Cycle one. It's such a good idea.
Yeah. And
Oh,
it's because a lot of us don't really know. I mean, we know, right? Like we have our menstrual cycle, but we are in this age where a lot of us are really coming into relationship with the menstrual cycle. And so, yeah, it's kind of a fun name.
yeah, I love it. Well, thank you so much, Emily. It's been such an honor and a pleasure to have you on here to share your stories and your wisdom. And yeah, I've just had so much fun talking to you. So thank you for this.
Thank you for having me. It's been so fun. Like we chat on Instagram, but this is so sweet.
Yeah, it's been amazing. Thank you for tuning in to the wisdom of the womb today. It's truly an honor to bring these stories forward, and it would mean so much to me if you'd rate and review this podcast so that it can reach even more women. If you're looking for deeper support, you can find the link to book a one-on-one virtual session in the show notes. thoughts. See you next week.